the webinar is only set for 40 minutes, so we'll do half an hour of a presentation and we'll do questions if they fit, or else we'll do them in the end. Yes, so Gary, it's just your turn. Just bring it along.
All right, terrific. First, Mai, thank you so much for having me, and to the Invested.dk community, thank you so much for having me. Sorry we're having some webcam difficulties, but I'm thrilled to be here with you again. You guys always ask the best questions, and over the last few months, since the first time I presented with Christian and then with Eric, a number of you have joined us over at Deep Knowledge Investing, and I hope you've made a lot of money doing that, and we've been thrilled to have you. And you're all welcome as part of our community as well, and thanks for welcoming me back today. When we originally spoke back in November, a big part of the conversation I had with Christian was that we were seeing signs of inflation. And at the time, you know, people thought that the US Federal Reserve wouldn't raise rates until sometime in 2024 or 2025. Chairman Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, was saying inflation is going to be transitory. We put in writing there's no possible way he could know that. That was complete and utter nonsense. And what we saw was this possibility of a huge amount of inflation. And at that time, we told the members of our community and the members of your community to do things like buy gold, buy silver, buy oil, Bitcoin, and to hedge. And those trades have all worked out really well. And anyone who's done that has made substantially more money off those trades than they would have paid in subscription fees. And that's what we're here for. And we're really glad about that. Now, unfortunately, as we all know, Russia has invaded Ukraine. And while that is certainly a huge tragedy for the people of Ukraine and also for the Russians who don't want to be there, what it has done is it's accelerated our thesis that the dollar is in trouble. It's accelerated inflation, and it's put under attack the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. That's not something that's going to happen in the next couple of months, but long term, there have been some things that have been put in place that are going to create problems for us. So, Mai, if you want, what is it we should cover now? Should we be talking about inflation, that GDP is overstated, the sanctions, reserve currency? We've got a whole wide list of topics. What do you think people are going to be most interested in first?
We would like to hear about how the sanctions is threatening the U.S. Status as the world currency, reserve currency. So that, and I think also our community would like to hear, how does this affect your average European investor?
Okay, fair enough. So let's start with the beginning on this. And a huge part of it is inflation. And we're seeing that in the US, and we're also seeing that in Europe. So Russia is an enormous exporter of oil and gas. And so we've all seen the price of energy go through the roof. Now, this is a problem for Europe in general because the EU is a huge importer of Russian oil and gas. And it's a bigger problem for Germany than anybody else. And one of the things that's an issue with this is a lot of people will think, well, wait a minute, oil and gas are commodities. So, you know, if the Russians sell their oil and gas to China, then who's ever selling to China can just send that to Europe and to Germany, and it'll all be fine. The problem with that is energy is very difficult to transport. There aren't enough ships to do that, and the current method for getting energy from Russia to Europe is pipelines, which is by far the most efficient way to do it. So you start shutting down those pipelines, and Europe's going to have problems. And right now, the United States is having problems because we're a very, very large country, the third largest country in the world by land mass. Outside of the cities, we don't have the kind of population density that you see in Europe. And as a result, it's very common for Americans to drive 30 to 60 minutes as a commute to get to work and 30 to 60 minutes back. And when gas prices have doubled and tripled, that becomes a problem. The next place we're seeing issues is food. And Ukraine is a gigantic exporter of corn and wheat in particular, and Russia is a huge exporter of fertilizer. And so as Russians start to limit exports of fertilizer, we're going to see crop yields decrease. And that's a big deal when farmers don't have the same incentive to plant and when people need the same amount of food. And so we're looking at increasing prices, decreasing availability, and some of it isn't even about pricing. There's a lot of Ukrainian crops that need to be planted now for summer harvest. Well, is anybody planting right now? People are leaving the country or they're defending their country. And so these are enormous problems. And what we saw, I think it was over the weekend. Did you guys see this? That German food prices are scheduled to go up 20 to 50% this week. Mai, did you see that?
Didn't see it. No, unfortunately.
Yeah. So unfortunately, you know, a lot of people haven't seen it, but really unfortunately, if you're going to go buy food in Germany, I mean, for everyone who's listening to this, try to imagine what happens. You go to the grocery store last week and your food bill is a certain amount. You go to the grocery store this week and it's 50% more. Right? I mean, this is really going to affect people's lives, and it's going to doubly do so when it's not just pricing, it's availability. And so, you know, there's sort of this sense, from what I understand, both in the political centers of power in Washington, D.C., and also in the EU, that, hey, we got them. We got the Russians, right? We're making them suffer. And to a large extent, that's true. We are making them suffer, but guess what? We're also going to be paying a huge price for these sanctions as well. You can't make it difficult for the Russians to export fertilizer, oil, gas, for Ukraine to export food and not have it affect our lives as well. And so the Russians aren't the only ones living with sanctions. We're all living with sanctions, and that is going to affect the EU, I think, primarily in energy, to a secondary extent on food. And in the US, that'll be reversed. In the US, it's really going to hit us on food, and then the secondary effect will be energy. So these are, you know, this is the place all of this starts. Moving on, a lot of the actions being taken seem like they make a lot of sense and are going to harm the dollar as the world's reserve currency. So one of the great examples of this is, you know, we told the Russians, well, you know, we're going to freeze your sovereign wealth, your dollar-based reserves. That's pretty close to stealing their money. Now, we can have a really good, interesting debate on this. Is that a justified action? Is that a moral action? And it's really easy to say, sure, of course it is. The Russians are using that money to make war. We have a moral obligation to take the actions that we can to not fund that. Right? That's not crazy. When we hear that Washington, D.C. is doing that, the White House is doing that, nobody thinks, wow, that's a crazy, stupid thing to do. It makes sense on a certain level, right? We look at the goals of their policy and say, these are good goals. And that part makes sense, but here's the problem. The problem is we've also sent the message to the rest of the world that you think that your dollar reserves are safe. You view the dollar as hard currency, as safe currency. And that's true as long as you're in step with the political preferences of Washington, D.C. And it's really easy to say, well, come on, you know, the Russians are making war on a free and independent people. That's a pretty high bar. And I agree with that. There's something to be said for, listen, we're not sanctioning people for saying we don't like this politician or we don't like that political party. But then take a look at what happened in Canada recently, where the government forced the banks to shut down the bank accounts of the Canadian truckers who were exercising. I don't know the rules in Canada, but in the United States, it would have been a peaceful, protected First Amendment protest, a free speech protest. and the government didn't like what the truckers were protesting and froze their assets. Between those two things is a whole area where other countries might say, you know, Washington changes its leadership every 4 years or every 8 years. We don't really want our money to be subject to that. And so the share of dollars that are being held in reserves by other countries has been declining for years. And more people are holding euros, or they're holding Chinese yuan, or they're holding gold, right? So these actions against Russia are going to accelerate that trend away from the dollar, right? The next thing that was done is the US cut off access to the SWIFT system. Now, for the benefit of the people on this call who aren't familiar with that, it sounds like this really complicated thing. SWIFT is simply a messaging system, right? So imagine a situation where, you know, I owe you $100, right? And so you send me a text message saying, hey, Gary, you owe me the $100. And I say, okay, Mai, I'm sending you the $100 now. Can you please confirm receipt? And you send it back. That's what SWIFT is. It's a messaging system where we confirm receipt and transfer of funds, right? And so we cut the Russians off from that. Again, this makes sense, right? Why should we help their banks operate if their banks are funding a war? Well, here's the problem. The United States doesn't have a monopoly on messaging systems, and the Russians simply joined the newer and less robust Chinese system. Now, the Chinese version of SWIFT doesn't carry as many messages. It's not as robust. It's not as good as SWIFT, but we just carved off a whole sphere of influence and put it in the Chinese camp, right? Is this going to be a problem for us in the next 2-3 years? Nope. But long term, we've just handed more power and more influence to Chinese hands. Now, is that good for the United States? Nope. Is that good for Europe, our allies in the EU? No, absolutely not. And these things are going to create a problem.
Yeah, and actually I have a really good question from one of our members from our community. Jakob, he asked, what will China and Russia try to use instead of dollars?
So the Chinese system operates off of yuan, and the Chinese right now, they'd love for the yuan to be the global reserve currency. They realize they're nowhere close to that. But anything they can do to weaken the dollar as the global reserve currency serves Chinese interests. And so there's a reason why right now we're seeing, I mean, it's one thing for the Russians to say to the EU and Germany in particular, you want our oil, you have to pay in either rubles or in gold. And I actually think there might be an offer out there to pay in Bitcoin, which I find fascinating, right?
Okay.
And like, let's give Putin credit for being hilarious on this, right? I mean, to say, forget the contract, pay us in rubles. And he's been successful in that if you take a look at the chart of the Russian ruble against the dollar, it plummeted when the war started. It's regained all of its value, and part of that have been these kind of stunts. But I'm less worried about that than I am about the fact that the petrodollar is being broken. And so right now, Saudi Arabia is in negotiations with China for oil purchases to be priced in yuan.
Okay.
And that is a big deal because the petrodollar creates huge offshore demand for the US dollar. And it's one of the reasons why the US, like the EU, can run enormous budget deficits. And so, you know, for people listening to this and thinking, okay, well, how does that affect us? It's terrible for the United States, but we're also a huge ally, a huge military supporter, and a huge trading partner for Europe. So if all of a sudden the US can't run the deficits that we run, and the value of the dollar plummets, and trust in the dollar plummets, in what universe is that good for Europe? And if you want a recent example of what can happen, let's all think back, and somebody can check the dates. I think it was about 8 years ago, but you guys should remember when Greece was talking about default, right? And business ground to a halt. And I can tell you, in the hedge fund community in New York, we were glued to this. What happens if a member of the EU declares bankruptcy,
Yeah.
right? What does
Yeah.
that do to the euro? And these things become huge problems in an interconnected global environment. Now, somebody might say, well, what we're seeing is the unwinding of globalization, and that is absolutely true. And I was just talking about Russia and China carving out a sphere of influence, Saudi Arabia decoupling a little bit from the United States as a petrodollar ally. But
Mm.
here's the thing, for hundreds of years, the United States and Europe have been allies. And we've had our spats, but for the most part, we've been great supporters of each other, both in peacetime with trade and wartime in a variety of conflicts. A situation that's that bad for the dollar, like again, remember, Greece has a tiny economy, and we were all panicked over that 8 years ago. If
Mm.
if the US dollar is no longer the reserve currency, that's not going to be good for the sphere of influence where the United States and Europe have a longstanding partnership. You guys don't want us to not be able to buy European goods.
No, we sure won't. Gary, thank you for that. I remember when we met before here, we talked about that you had a piece that you probably could show our community a piece for a newspaper. So I was thinking maybe we can use the last period going over that piece that you had.
Sure. So
Because then I can give you the screen and then our audience can look at something else than this disclaimer because we don't have a presentation today, but maybe if it's possible, we can see do you know which newspaper it's going to be published in?
so it will be in the Epic Times, and
Mm.
I can't bring it up right now. And the reason for that is because it's been submitted but not
Oh,
published yet. So
okay.
the best thing that I can tell everybody listening to
Mm.
this is you're getting an advance on tomorrow's news or next week's news. This will be in the paper sometime between tomorrow and next week. So um,
Okay.
in case you're wondering about the value that Invested.dk brings you, we literally have tomorrow's news. The only thing that I'd add to the items that we're talking about, to Swift and these pricing issues, is there are other places where we've tried to put pressure
Mm.
on Russia. And so you saw Visa and American Express pull out. And is that a big deal? Well, it would have been if we'd been able to bring their payment system to a halt. But here's the issue.
Mm.
We go back to a few years ago to the Russian invasion of Crimea. Um, the United States sanctioned them then. And the Russians said, you know what, we really don't want the United States and US corporations to have this level of control and influence over us. So what the Russians did, was they put in place their own payment system. And then they said, okay, hey, Amex and Visa, you're welcome to operate here, but you're going to operate on our backbone, on our system. And so what
Mm.
happened was, when the war started and Visa and American Express pulled out, the Russians said, yeah, fine, no problem. They called China and said, send over Union Pay cards. And so now the entire Russian system is running off of a Russian backbone and Chinese cards. And again, this is the same thing we're seeing over and over and over again. And one of the issues that we have is the current administration in the United States is not communicating this to to the American taxpayer, to the American citizens. And my guess is that, and you can tell me, my guess is that Europe's leaders aren't telling you guys this either. And our issue is not that defending Ukraine and trying to limit Russia's actions are not
Mm.
admirable. They are, but we should know what it's going to cost us.
Mm. Yeah. Gary, I have one more question from one of our members. Are you ready for a question?
Of course.
Yeah, it's from Torben. And he asks, it sounds like the dollar will decrease in value in the future. Any idea by how much in the next year? What's your guess on that?
That's a genius question. Okay. And I love that question, and I'm going to give you an answer to it, but tell you there's going to be no way to check it. And here's why. I don't know the measure you use in Europe, but I did see, it was either earlier this week or last week, wasn't the EU inflation number 7 point something percent? Didn't you guys have a number like that? I'm pretty sure I saw it.
I haven't seen the number, but
All right.
mm,
I saw something in the news. You guys are somewhere
mm,
between 7 and 8%, which, by the way, is a huge number. That is
mm,
enormous. So in the United States, the number that people use to calculate is called the CPI. It's the Consumer Price Index.
mm,
And the idea is that we take a basket of common goods and services, we weight them according to some reasonable estimate of how big a part of people's life that these things are. And then we
mm,
compare year over year, what's the increase in pricing? And that would make sense. Okay, well, here's the problem. The problem is in the United States, that number is a lie. It's complete and total nonsense, and I can explain to you why. And let's just take three great examples. The most obvious example is if you go back 40 years, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, was calculated based on what people spent on housing. In the
mm,
statistics, it's called shelter, whether you own a home or rent a home. And back in 1998, 99, I think it was, the Clinton administration changed the rules from the actual housing cost to owner's equivalent rent, which is a really fancy way of asking people, how much would your home rent for? The problem is that that number, the increase in that number is a tiny
mm,
fraction. So what we're seeing in the United States are housing prices up by 18, 19, 20%. And the owner's equivalent rent, which is a lie, is up by 4.5%. That's a third of the index. I'll give you another example, is food. So
mm,
last year, worldwide food prices were up 24%. That's the UN number. Now we're seeing Germany is increasing prices by 20 to 50%. Okay. And last year in the United States, the increase in food prices officially was 6%. So Americans eat a relatively expensive diet. We have a lot of meat, chicken,
mm,
pork, bacon, right? We eat
mm.
relatively expensive food. We eat well here. So is there anybody on this call, somebody tell me, is there anyone on this call who really believes that food inflation in the United States is 1/4 of what it is in the rest of the world? Is that even remotely possible? It's
Mm,
not. And then the
no.
final thing is, if you actually look at, and we don't expect other people to do this, but we're finance guys. We love research at Deep Knowledge Investing. We
Mm,
actually pull the report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And when we look at that, they tell you we've adjusted 70 items. We've adjusted 72 items. Basically, they got the number, didn't like the number, and said, let's make up another number. So let me ask you, Mai, what do you think the probability is that the government is making inflation look worse than it is?
mm. With what you're saying, it sounds as if they are
No, I'm saying they're making it look better.
less. Yeah.
That's
Okay.
right. They're
Yeah.
reducing it. So the original, let's go back to the original question.
Mm,
The original question was, how much does the dollar decline this year? I think right now, the rate of inflation in the United States is 16%. I think the real number, not the reported number, the real number in another month or two is going to exceed 20%. So if you're holding dollars, your
mm,
purchasing power is going to decrease by 20+% over the course of the next year. Now, some people will say, no, 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 the dollar's strong, and they're looking at the dollar versus the euro or versus the won or the ruble, and that doesn't matter. How much oil, gold, silver, Bitcoin, like how much food can you buy? And the answer
mm,
is going to be a whole lot less. And I think inflation is going to be over 20%. And so
mm.
that's the real loss in purchasing power, not how many euros can we buy, how many loaves of bread can we buy?
Yes, thank you. I have a question here. I think I have more 5 questions for you. So maybe a bit short answers, Gary. We
All
would
right.
appreciate that. So this is from Lotte. She asked, what happens if we have American stocks and the dollar is no longer in use? Will the amount of our stocks be exchanged to another currency? Well, that's a pretty wild question, Liselotte.
Yeah, so that's like the zombie apocalypse
Mm,
question. I don't think, let me clarify. When I talk about the dollar weakening as the world's
mm,
reserve currency, I don't mean that the dollar is going to go away. I mean that other countries will hold reserves in other currencies, and it will reduce the ability of the United States government to
mm,
run $5 trillion budget deficits and finance it by just sending dollars out that people need to buy oil.
mm.
I'm not so much worried about the zombie apocalypse situation where the dollar shuts down and the stock market keeps working. That I see as very unlikely.
Yes. This is from Nils, the next question. So should we invest in China now, since the currency will be strengthened?
So
I think,
it's Yeah, so I wouldn't for two reasons. One is it's not clear that China is going to have a strong currency. China has a history of
mm,
manipulating their currency. Our preference is to shift out of dollars and into equities, gold, silver, Bitcoin, oil, commodities, real estate. We want to own hard assets. Owning Chinese yuan, where the Chinese government can manipulate it, isn't great. The other issue with Chinese equities is they're manipulated by the government and their reporting standards are horrendous. The amount of fraud there is incredible, and that's one of the
mm.
reasons why they won't let their companies be audited. So basically, if you're investing in a Chinese company without an audit that's not affiliated with the Chinese government, fingers crossed that you own what you think you own.
And thank you. And this is from Jakob. Are you bearish in the market? Are you bearish in the on the markets currently? And can this make the US dollar go up short term?
So short term, yeah, look, anything can happen. In terms of it going up, let's define that. Going up versus other currencies, yeah, sure, absolutely. And that to a large extent is what we've seen, right? And the dollar has been that safe haven versus other currencies. Going up versus what can you really buy with it? No, that's not where we are. Everything that you go buy is getting more and more expensive, and that's the case not only in Europe but also here in the United States where we're paying with dollars. Mai, what was the beginning of that question again?
Are you bearish like in a bear? I don't know
Yeah,
if I'm pronouncing it
you
correct,
are.
but
You are.
bearish in the market, like the bear.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So in general, I am. Inflation is so bad that the Federal Reserve is going to have
Yeah.
no choice but to raise rates. When they do that, that's going to be difficult for the markets. That said, we do own select very high quality companies that are either well positioned to deal with this, like oil producers, or companies where there's a huge amount of growth and we think they'll continue to perform well even in a rough environment. So basically, we own commodities as inflation hedges. We own individual stocks that we think will perform well, and then we have large market hedges on because I am bearish about the market in general. And what I'm betting is that our stock picks at Deep Knowledge Investing are going to outperform the general market. And big picture, we've done that pretty consistently.
Great. And this is a crazy question from Martin. Could we see a scenario where the petrodollar would be replaced by CO2 quotes in some way in order to save the dollar and avoid the US to go bankrupt?
Wait, sorry, replaced by what? What is it in quotes?
In Danish we say CO2 quotes, so it's the oh, I can't remember the English word for this, but it's carbon dioxide. Thank you, Matthias. Carbon credits. People are helping me here. In Danish, we say CO2 quotes, and yeah,
Got
people
it.
are helping me. So should I say it again? Crazy question. Could we see a scenario where the petrodollar could be replaced by carbon dioxide quotes in some way in order to save the dollar and avoid the US to go bankrupt?
Yeah, so those are really two different issues. The fact is that um, right now, we're not ready to make the transition to alternative energy.
Mm,
You really, right now, today, you need to make one of two choices. Either that you're going to do what the United States or Germany does, which is rely on what's drilled out of the ground, right? It's primarily going to be oil and gas, or in the United States, we do use a certain amount of coal. Only the scrubbers on there have gotten pretty good. Um, the other option is the French model, where they get 75% of their energy from nuclear.
mm,
And if you take a look, Gen 4 nuclear is completely different, right? They don't melt down, they don't produce nuclear waste, they actually eat nuclear waste. They can be smaller scale, they're much safer. So that would be a direction to go. What carbon credits would do is accelerate a shift away from what's still, I can't believe I'm saying this with oil at $100 a barrel, but still relatively inexpensive fossil fuels in
mm,
exchange for more expensive alternative energy. That's not going to help the dollar. The other thing is, those calculations, when people talk about the benefits of alternative energy, um,
mm,
don't include the costs of that alternative energy. So let me just give you one really good example. People like wind power, right? It's renewable, it's free. Okay, great. But if you take a look at a windmill, those blades, those three blades on the windmill, are larger than aircraft wings, and they're made out of plastic. And my goodness, that's a lot of oil. On top of that, because these things are so enormous and you can't have them blowing over, you need to ground them in an enormous amount of concrete. And the energy that it takes, not only to pour that concrete, but to cool it,
mm,
is huge. And so people look at the energy coming out of a windmill and say, look, it's clean, it's free. No, no, it's not. You need a ton of oil to produce those blades. You need a lot of fossil fuel related cooling to get the cement in place. um, the windmills are actually huge users of fossil fuels.
mm.
So those calculations are all over the place. Basically, carbon credits is the government putting their thumb on the scale. We don't see it as solving a problem, and certainly it actually would make inflation in the U.S. worse and weaken the dollar further.
Okay, thank you, Gary. This is going to be the last question, and it's from Torben. Do you think the inflation will remain high in a 3 to 5 year horizon?
Wow. Okay.
So it's
Great. Yeah.
yeah.
Great question. And here I have to be really careful. And here's why. When 5 or 6 months ago, Chairman of the Fed, Jerome Powell, said inflation is going to be transitory. And Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, said the same thing. We have all of these high-level officials in the US saying inflation will be transitory. We put in writing, there's no way they could know that. This is complete nonsense, right?
Mm,
So what I can tell you is we see long-term trends in place that are going to make inflation a problem. But I have to pause because of two things. The first thing is, these are circular issues, right? The higher inflation is, the more the Fed will raise rates, and the more that will cool the economy. One way or another, we're going to have demand destruction. And there's an old saying, the best cure for high oil prices is high oil prices, right? People use less
mm,
oil, they drive less, they turn the thermostat down and wear another sweater, right? And so these things end up being self-curing. But I also want to be careful, because I don't want to exercise the same ridiculous hubris that we were criticizing officials for, right? If I'm saying Jerome Powell can't know that inflation is transitory, then it's very hard for me to tell you, yeah,
mm.
I know where inflation will be over the next 3, 4, 5 years. Then I'm kind of guilty of doing the same thing that we criticize other people for doing. As much as I would love to give you a really clear answer to that, sometimes just honesty and humility leads us to say it's a great question, but I don't know. And I got to leave it at I don't know.
You can't know it all. And I think
No,
that's very authentic of you, not trying to do that. And Torben he says thank you. So, and I also want to say thank you to you, Gary. And you actually have a wonderful offer for our community. I'll send it out in the email after this webinar. But can you talk a little bit about the offer you have for the invested members?
sure, of course. Thank you. So what deep knowledge investing does is we provide a limited number of high return actionable investment ideas and timely market commentary. And so, just think about our last couple of calls telling people to short the market in early January, telling people to buy oil, gold, silver in November. We've been ahead of the curve, and those are money making calls. We help people make money. And so what we do is we offer everyone from Invested.dk a free month. Come check us out, subscribe. You do not owe us anything. If you feel like you get value from what we're doing, then great, stick around, be part of our community. If you don't, just go online, cancel within the first month. You won't be charged anything ever. And we've had some of your people do that, and great, thanks for coming to check us out. And we've had some of your people come and stay, and thanks for sticking with us and for being part of our community. I will tell you, if we get any more Danish subscribers, we may need to have a bilingual deep knowledge investing website, or at a minimum, just have a landing page in Danish. But we're happy to have you. And if any of you guys want to check out what we're doing, just come and be with us for the first month at no cost, and make a decision, after a few weeks, and see if it's something where we can help you.
Great, great. And yeah, the link is in the you'll everybody receive the email, and you can check it out free via the link that's in the email. And I want to thank everybody for their patience. Only a couple actually dropped off. We had like a couple of people dropping off when they saw that there wasn't any presentation and they only had to look at my face and the boring picture here. But actually, we have a pretty hardcore investing membership community, because most of you guys, you stayed. And I was looking at the numbers when you, Gary, fell out, and it was only me panicking and flapping here like a fish. But again, only a couple of people, they disappeared. So thank you for listening in, everybody, and thank you, Gary, for enlightening us and coming on. We really appreciate you contributing to this little Danish community. And that's all from me. Yeah, and everybody Lisa Lotte is like, thanks a lot for a great webinar. Thank you for a very informative evening. Thank you, Gary, from Jakob. And Daniel says, thanks for a nice speech, Gary. It was interesting and really great. So it's not only me, Gary, but thank you so much for coming on today.
That's so nice. Thank you, all of you. It's lovely to be back in Copenhagen again. I'm
Yeah.
always thrilled to be here. And by the way, I want to compliment you and Eric and Christian on this amazing community. One of the things that we love is the questions that I get from our Danish members are phenomenal, even to the point where we've made changes to our website. We've added pages because of questions that have come in from your community. So we do listen to you guys, love to have your input and your feedback. And thanks for having me. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you guys.